hi, or hey, or hello, or whatever. I don't have an intro. If you look at the title of the video is, wait, what is this? What is Linux? Do you know anything about Linux? If you ask this question to a lot of people, students or parents or whatever, they think it was some kind of an alien language, or maybe it was mysteriously don't know what it is. Yeah, I think if you click this video, you might probably learn one or two things about Linux. So yeah, let's get into it. So what is Linux? So Linux is, well, a lot of people, some people maybe know about Linux, but they think it was they refer to it as Ubuntu, or maybe, basically Ubuntu, because Ubuntu is a bit common than any other, well, not really common, because Linux is like 2% of the marketplace right now, but that was referring to the desktop users. So Linux, people might refer it to as an operating system, but it's actually not an operating system. It's basically a kernel. So what is kernel? Kernel is basically like the heart of the operating system. It talks to the hardware that you are using right now, basically a phone or a laptop, or maybe your peripherals like keyboard or mouse. That kernel can talk to these devices to actually work in the operating system. So yeah, without the kernel, the operating system might not work. So you might wondering, Windows have kernel or macOS have kernel? Well, yes, they do. Windows, they're using the NT kernel, which is the new technology kernel, which they make back in Windows XP, I think. All of the operating system need a kernel to talk to the hardware, including macOS. Yes, macOS also has kernel. Do you know what kernel is it? FreeBSD. Well, the more you know, right? So Linux kernel was developed way back in 90 something. If you look at the Wikipedia or whatever that I came out with the screen. It was developed first by Linus Torvald. So he's the guy who actually developed the kernel first. So Linux have been using in everywhere in the Linux, using a devices that uses Linux kernel. For example, this one, the Android phone that you've been holding to. If you look at the about phone, right? If you scroll down and you see the kernel version, right? So it says Linux, right? You're actually using Linux. Another device that can be found using a Linux is basically the server cloud computers. Like for example, Amazon Web Service, they use Linux. Google Clouds, they all use a Linux servers. So basically, if you want to host a server, to host a website or whatever, they're actually using Linux instead of using other operating system. So what you're referring to Ubuntu is not actually referring to as a Linux. Ubuntu is actually part of Linux. It's actually called a distribution of Linux, or Linux community call it distro. Well, for people who are lazy to call it distribution, there's a lot of variation and selection of distro of Linux that you can choose. One example is Ubuntu, which I mentioned before, and Ubuntu is part of Debian distro. And you might have heard Pop! OS. Pop! OS is also part of Ubuntu. Another one is what I think is Fedora. Fedora is what I currently using right now. There's another distro that you can try, which is a Linux Mint. Another distro that you can try, which is the Endeavour OS, Clear Linux, Arch Linux, Artix. Well, basically there's a lot of distro that you can actually use right now. They have a lot of distro which actually comes from another distribution, basically built on top of it, or basically make a modification. Well, the great thing about having much more distro is that it caters to a lot of people. Basically, it depending on the people's use case. Like for example, if you are a beginner into Linux, maybe you can try Ubuntu or Linux Mint, or maybe even Fedora. There's other distribution that caters to the server, like the Red Hat, RHEL, whatever that is. It's Clear Linux. There's other distribution that for advanced user, like for example, Arch Linux Gen 2, for example, Linux from scratch. There's a lot of modification that people can use to cater to specific user to fit their needs, basically. So that's one of the great things about using Linux, because you can modify the system whatever you want, unlike using for example Windows or macOS, which has a limit of modification that you can do because it's proprietary, and Windows or Microsoft or Apple doesn't want you to basically edit the operating system as you like. So yeah, that's about it for the distribution of Linux. Well, if the Linux is really that great, well, then I can use it so that I can run like games or any creative application. Not really. So see, if different operating systems have different types of applications that you need to different operating system. If you as a developer, right, trying to develop an application, you want to develop applications specifically for the operating system that you want to cater with. So for example, like Windows is using like an exe application that you can run, but in Linux it's actually a bit different when you try to run application. Well, you don't really need to know about this, but I'm going to do the next video. Is it going to be easy to actually switch Linux? Well, for me personally, I don't think it actually worth switching to Linux. For a lot of people that who watch this video, you probably don't really need to switch. There's multiple reasons. First of all, it's actually you need a really good computer knowledge about how do you want to install the Linux in your laptop or desktop. Second of all, if you're using some kind of like heavy application, like for example Adobe, right, or Microsoft Office, and you really rely on them, they actually don't provide that application to Linux users, unfortunately. So yeah, basically if you want to switch Linux, you really have to think about it. But most use case for a lot of people, especially for beginners, right, usually if you want to open a desktop or laptop, people usually just browsing the applications. They don't really do anything much other than for specific people like gamers, right? So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you like it. Thumbs up, whatever that is. Subscribe, I guess. I see you in the next video where I can show you how to install Linux. So yeah, until then, see you next time. Goodbye.